Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Job Accommodation Network's Accommodation and Compliance audio and web training series. I'm Beth Loy, and I will be the moderator for today's program called Veterans with TBI and Co-Occurring Conditions, featuring Melanie Wetzel, Jan's Cognitive Psych Team Leader, and Stephen Heck, a PhD student from West Virginia University's Center for Excellence in Disabilities. Now, before we start the program, I want to go over just a few housekeeping items. First, if any of you experience technical difficulties during the webcast, please call us 800-526-7234 for voice and hit button 5. Or for TTY, call 877-781-9403. Second, we plan to answer as many of your questions as we can during the presentation, so please send in your questions at any time to the webcast to our email account, question@askjan.org, or you can use our question and answer pod located at the bottom of your screen. To use the pod, just type your question and then submit it to the question queue. Also on the bottom of your screen, you'll notice a file share pod that you can use if you have difficulty viewing the slides or would like to download them. You'll also find a nice handout here that Melanie and Stephen put together. It's a resource handout that you can download. And finally, I want to remind you that at the end of the webcast, an evaluation form will automatically pop up on your screen in another window. This is if you don't have your pop-ups blocked. Now, we really appreciate your feedback, so please stay logged on to fill out that evaluation form. So now let's get ready. Let's go ahead and start today's program. Stephen, take it away.
Hi, my name is Stephen Heck, and I'm a PhD student here at West Virginia University. I'll get a little more about my background in a moment, but just wanted to go over what I'm planning on talking about in my portion of this session. So basically, I was asked to talk about, the veterans with traumatic brain injuries and what's that like. So I want to be able to talk about how that's different than the general population and, what that experience is like. So I'm going to highlight some of the differences. I want to look at some of their exposures. So we're going to look at some things like BLAST, what it's like to get a traumatic brain injury while deployed. And then I'm hoping that this will help you understand and overcome some barriers with veterans that have traumatic brain injuries. So as I said, a little bit about my background. I have 10 years of experience in the military. I spent 6 years on active duty before I transitioned to the reserves, still serving in the reserves. I also worked at the Defense and Veterans Brain Injury Center, which works with both active duty and veterans on basically looking at intervention and other programs to help veterans have traumatic brain injuries, survivors. So also work in brain injury rehabilitation services. A lot of my research interests are on the same thing with traumatic brain injuries and the military studies. And some of the things that I've been working on have been like the art therapy mass creation intervention, looking at improving quality of life, trying to work on some understanding of knowledge of concussion, trying to develop some educational programs there, and then evaluating some of the Medicaid data and looking at how, the state is running some of that, as well as looking at the experience of Reserve and National Guard members and how they're balancing military life requirements. And then obviously, as mentioned, I am a PhD student here at West Virginia University. So starting off, I just want to give a basic definition of what is a traumatic brain injury. It's a direct blow or jolt to the head. Now, a lot of people think that it has to be, some sort of impact on your head, like that direct blow, but no, you can get it from things like whiplash as well, and other things like some of that external force, like a blast wave, can disrupt some of the patterns as well. So it doesn't always have to be, that thinking of NFL, like a helmet-to-helmet collision or things like that, or head-to-ground collision. Sometimes it's just the shaking of the head back and forth. You can also have some sort of penetrating head injuries too. When the military said, they're looking at like shrapnel or other things that kind of, fracture the brain. So basically, there's 4 types of traumatic brain injuries. I'm not going to go into the detailed definitions of every one, but you have concussion, mild traumatic brain injuries would be the first one. And then for that one, you're really looking at, a loss of consciousness for up to about 30 minutes is one of the criteria for that. A moderate traumatic brain injury is basically a loss of consciousness from more than 30 minutes but less than 24 hours. So it's that extended time of, loss of consciousness. And then severe traumatic brain injury is a loss of consciousness for more than 24 hours. And you're noticing these time frames. So the longer you're unconscious for, usually there's a lot more damage going on within the brain. And then there's the penetrating traumatic brain injuries, and that simply is just any time that the skull gets fractured. So I wanted to address a couple myths that I thought would be important to talk about here on traumatic brain injuries, and the one there being, Knowing which parts of the brain will have injured will tell you the specific challenges to expect, and that's not exactly true. While we know that, there's certain areas of the brain control other areas and location can provide some indication, but it's not always that specific, and it doesn't always tell you the recovery time or how long things will last, and the brain is very adaptive, so, sometimes your right hemisphere will take over for issues that were damaged in the left hemisphere. So it's not always as accurately as predicting as, hey, it was damage to this frontal lobe, therefore they're going to have memory problems. It doesn't always equate to that. Another myth is the best way to help a person with brain injuries is assist them with tasks, and this isn't necessarily the case. You don't always want to finish sentences for them or finish the task for them. Sometimes you just got to avoid that helping and let them be able to do the work independently. You don't want to take that, freedom away from them from doing things. But you still want to be as supportive as possible as you can. Most recoveries from the brain show steady improvement up until 2 years when recovery is complete. There's really oftentimes no timeline for when recovery is going to be complete. And it's very inconsistent, too. Some people might have a traumatic brain injury and, within a week and not show any symptoms and have a problem-free rest of their life, while other people will have just one traumatic brain injury and just have the rest of their lifetime that they're dealing with it. So you're not always knowing what's going on, and then sometimes you have symptoms that will come up later that weren't there with the initial brain injury. So it's very hard to predict that one. And then another one is after a brain injury, a person's basic emotional needs change. And this definitely isn't the case. They still have the basic same emotional needs as everybody else does. So that treat respect and dignity, and allow them to be as helpful as you possibly can with them. So moving in more into military traumatic brain injuries, there's been a lot of research and studies done on this. So a lot of these service-related brain injuries are leading to, long-term health and socioeconomic consequences. So there's that social aspect of it, of not having the social relationships that they've been able to have before, maintaining jobs, maintaining families. And so there's challenges with that, as well as the long-term health, and all these things play a part with each other. So with traumatic brain injuries in the military, it's considered the signature injury of the wars. Mainly because that's the thing, if you ask most people, what injuries do they think of? With Iraq and Afghanistan, brain injuries is going to come up, and then loss of limbs and amputation. So these are basically the signature injuries of the war. And to think about with this is that there's a growing number of survivors over like World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korean, and all this is due to the advancing technologies. We're able to save more people's lives. And this has a lot to do with like the body armor that we're able to use, the new helmets, all the new gear, the new equipment. A lot of the vehicles are all armored. So all this stuff helps them survive the rocket attacks, but then ends up having a lot of, other sorts of injuries associated with it. So you get the brain injuries, we're getting, loss of limbs, but we're still able to save these people's lives. And so then it's bringing them back home and how we're able to reincorporate them back into society. So looking at some of the uniqueness of the military traumatic brain injury, especially in the combat environment with this, it exists with post-traumatic stress. So you're thinking, PTSD is very common with military. A lot of the combat that goes on over there can lead to PTSD. So this is what it's coming back with. So you have the concussion, and your mind's already stressed with the other trauma that you've experienced, and creates this comorbidity of conditions. There's issues with differences in gender and age distribution with military personnel, mainly because they're a lot younger. If you're looking in the civilian population, traumatic brain injuries happen to fall more with young kids or elderly population. So it's a little bit different there, with most of the military people being younger. And they also tend to be a bit healthier, which also tends to lead a little bit better to recovery, but it can also be a point of frustration, where you have a person that can be running, 2 miles in 12 minutes, and suddenly that loss of that ability can be the point of frustration for them. And then while they're in the military, they're less often subject to severe substance abuse, mainly because there's a lot of mandated programs, a requirement for being deployable. So a lot of the stuff is controlled. However, once they leave the military, then that has changed a little bit. So another big issue that comes up very often with the military is stigma. You usually hear this more associated with the mental health issues in it, but it's also there with traumatic brain injuries. So reporting becomes an issue, and sometimes they don't want to report. And that usually has to do with concerns about, being forced out of their unit, letting their battle buddies down, not always recognizing the symptoms of it at all. So that's where the issues come in with that one. And all this results in a delayed identification and reporting. And, when I was working in some TBI clinics, you had people that were reporting their brain injuries 6 years down the road. And with recovery, you really want to identify these a lot earlier. So after that point in time of 6 years, you're really just trying to, help them cope with the symptoms as opposed to actually rehabilitate them. So just different ways of looking at that. I want to talk about how common it is. Basically looking at a deployed setting again in Afghanistan and Iraq, it's a leading injury among U.S. forces. I mean, once again, there's that higher risk compared to civilian peers. And I think the one in that 2008 Department of Defense, if you're looking at, 7 out of 10 traumatic brain injuries were due to a blast. So once again, you're looking at a lot of stressful environment leading to a lot of PTSD, being comorbid with that. And then you're looking at falls as another high one, vehicular accidents, fragments. So if you're looking at explosion, things, being shot out and around, large objects can be caught in that. And then just looking at, once again, the overall in deployed, 82% are, in the mild category, with the rest being 6% in moderate and another 6% in severe, and then the remaining being an uncaused one. So some of these commonly reported symptoms, like in the first column, signs and symptoms after a brain injury, may include in that section. Those are ones that you more often times will see at the start. I mean, right after they need a blow to the head or something happens, these are the ones that you're initially going to see, but there's nothing to say that these can't last a lifetime either or last several years before they go away. So it's really hard to predict with them. One of the more common ones that I've seen and been able to talk with people about are headaches. Headaches are extremely common, loss of consciousness, confusion, dizziness. So, and especially delayed response to questions. I think once again, if you look to like the NFL, things like that, seeing people get concussions, there's that level of confusion, dizziness, where like, oh yeah, I'm ready to go back in and play again. You just don't always have that, cognitive process to realize, wait a minute, there's something wrong. So think of it in that way. And then there are other symptoms that can grow up over time. So trouble concentrating, you might not notice that immediately after brain injury, but you start moving on, try going back to work or going back to school, and then you're going to start to notice that being a problem. Irritability can sometimes come up, personality changes, mood swings. And then I think talking some of the mental health that comes with it, because you can't always control it. I mean, depending on where the area damage is in the brain, sometimes you lose that ability to regulate some of these things. So you can have that as verbal outbursts, physical outbursts, a lot of impulsive behavior, some risky behavior, and then the depression and anxiety, because that ability to control these can be a little bit limited. So, I mean, things that you or others are observed can be subtle and might not be easy to recognize with the TBI survivor. So, I mean, they might not be able to recognize these problems, but you might be able to recognize them better, and sometimes vice versa, where, you may not even be able to identify that the person is having some issues. So it's also important to note that everyone's experience with these symptoms are different, and not everyone experiences them to the same degree. And that's one thing to make note of, because it is always changing. This one is basically looking at the overall numbers for all branches of looking at how many traumatic brain injuries there is in the military. Since 2000 to 2018, there have been basically 384,000 traumatic brain injuries in the military. Once again, the majority of them falling into the mild traumatic brain injury. Now, this is looking at all, both the in-garrison and the deployed ones. One thing I wanted to talk about that is more unique to military is the blast-related traumatic brain injuries. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail about what this is like. Because there's basically four mechanisms that goes on with this. And there's the primary one, which is anything that happens from the result of the actual explosion can then damage, the neurons and axons in the brain, can cause a lot of cell issues with some of that shock waves, and you have secondary issues resulting from the debris and anything that's picked up and thrown, and then you have the tertiary stuff, which is basically anything like you're getting thrown from the blast. So if you're hitting a wall or being bounced around in a vehicle, some of the injuries associated with that. And then the quaternary ones, which are anything else basically. So if you're thrown into a building and then the building starts falling apart on top of you, or there's a fire and there's a fire associated with that. So next slide. And this one, I think, just provides a better visual of what we're talking about, because you can see the explosion right up in the front part, and that's the primary area, and then you're going to see all those particles and fragments in the air, which goes down to the secondary, and then you see the person flying backwards. And whatever he's landing in is going to be into that tertiary range. So with primary, the main one concerned here is the ears and the auditory system, because, this is the organ that's most affected, but, your ears inside your middle ear is also what controls your balance. And so it can lead to a lot of balance issues for a while. And so sometimes the ears will recover, sometimes the hearing will suddenly come back, other times it doesn't. Tinnitus is very common, that very large ringing in your ear where they might not be able to notice other noises. Tinnitus is one of the experiences I had from getting from the military, and the other day there's this low-level noise going on in a classroom, and I didn't recognize it as a noise until everybody else brings it up as a noise. So sometimes you're not always aware of these things going on. With the lung and abdomen with primary blast, you're going to be thinking about, anything with an air pocket in your body that is going to move differently. So it can end up causing a lot of bursting or other issues with your organs. So looking at secondary, just to think about it in this way, basically for any of these particles hitting you, it just has to travel 50 feet per second to cause a skin laceration. And then basically for it to actually puncture your skin and go in your body, you're looking at something traveling about 400 feet per second. And if you want to look at the shock wave that's coming from a blast, you're looking at something that's around 1,600 feet per second. So it's picking up a lot of objects that can traveling pretty quickly and being able to damage a lot of your soft tissue and be able to penetrate deeper. And then the other issue is a lot of contamination. So whatever is being picked up and thrown into you, you don't know what's going on with that, and it leads into a lot of infections and other problems. Looking at the tertiary ones, the body displacement. So here we're looking at a lot of fractures or amputations. This type of burns that we're talking about here are burns from the explosion, where when we move into quaternary, we're going to talk about, burns in this case, which is basically the building itself burning. And so you have collapsing buildings, displaced heavy objects, basically the heavy things falling on you. And then oftentimes there's smoke and toxic fumes from whatever's burning around you too. That can cause a lot of, lung issues. So that's what we're looking at there. Collapsed buildings is one of the things that we had an issue when I was in Afghanistan, where they had a building fall on top of one of our soldiers when they set off an IED and digging them out of the rubble and things like that. So this is something that does happen out there. From this one, I just wanted to give you an idea on what it's like or what it takes to get a soldier basically from, being in Afghanistan or Iraq and all the way back to basically the VA care. And it takes a while. It is a process. So you're looking at, if an injury happens in the middle of combat, they might not necessarily be able to immediately move you out of there. And sometimes they're going to be able to move you out to a certain area where the helicopters will be able to land and pick you up. Other times they're going to have to drive you all the way back to a base where they can get the helicopter to land, take you to basically the forward surgical teams, which is the area where they're really going to be able to stabilize you a lot better, but not be able to do much. They're basically just that first level trauma care. And then they're going to move you on to a much larger base, which has a much fuller medical staff for basically, further, stabilization and making sure that you'd be able to move you. And then next it's going to be generally going to move you to Landstuhl, which is in Germany, and then they'll be able to give you a lot better care there. And finally, depending on the nature of your injury, at 72 hours or later, they're finally bringing you back into the U.S. for your basically more long-term care. And it's either going to be at Walter Reed, depending on injuries, or you might end up in the San Antonio Army Medical Center. And then eventually you're moving into the VA system. And, this is just a long process from that initial traumatic brain injury, and you're not really going to necessarily get the rehab, at least until you're into Landstuhl, which can be a lot of delayed in being able to get into some rehabilitation. So for this section, basically, I'm going to look at what the veteran's experience of a traumatic brain injury is. This comes from a study that did a lot of interviews with veterans with brain injuries, and this is basically how they describe their experience. So they experienced the reduced physical and mental functioning. They always felt like, I had this one friend that described it as he had this excellent memory. He never needed to study for an exam to having what he called a normal memory. Now he needs to study for an exam. He needs to do more work and things into it. So there's that change. And then migraines, change in memory, and sensitivity to light. Those ones I've seen from soldiers like 6 years or more that still have, headaches, a lot of medication to them to try to help manage the headaches. And same thing with sensitivity to light. Oftentimes they need to wear glasses inside because of basically a lot of the fluorescent light bulbs, trigger the migraines and things like that. So in accommodation, sometimes it might help is, looking at natural light bulbs and then things like that, because there's this pulsating actually that comes from the fluorescent lights that actually kind of triggers some of the headaches and triggers other issues for them. Things that they found helpful was staying active and being physical. That's generally part of the military is, staying active. So it's something they're able to keep doing, and going back to school. These things have been able to, give them motivation to keep going on in their lives. They also found a lack of community support support was something that they identify, but I think if you're looking at this, you're coming from the military where it's kind of like this band of brothers where it becomes your family, and then you're moving out of that, and you don't necessarily have the same people that can understand. They don't have the same experiences as you, and so that can sometimes create a challenge of finding that community support. They also tend to do a lot of researching. So what are the best treatment options for them, which I thought was rather unique. I mean, most of the veterans that I've ever talked with, it doesn't matter necessarily their condition, but they're always trying to figure out what ways will make themselves better. So I think that one's usually a good one. Changes to health status, things that they reported, obviously the concentration and memory issues, increased irritability, so there's that, ability to regulate and control their mood that becomes a challenge. And then there's the change in symptoms and new symptoms after many years pass, which goes back to some of the original things I was saying with some of the myths. People expect these things to resolve themselves maybe in a couple of years, a couple months, or, a certain amount of time. And oftentimes, things will change. Headaches will get worse. And say you have multiple injuries, then you're looking at, we'll say, shrapnel wounds. Shrapnel tends to move around in the body, so you might have a lot of new symptoms that will come up. Some other things that they identified as post-injury factors in their recovery and things was, additional medical complications. So there's a lot of other comorbidities. So you're not only dealing with your traumatic brain injury, but you might have broken legs or broken limbs, and you're doing rehabilitation for those as well. And it comes with a lot of taxing on the person, both their mind and body, to be able to go through this. Timely medical and neurological and rehabilitative services. Once again, if you go back to that diagram of how long it takes to get from basically a combat theater to where you're getting rehabilitation, is quite a bit of time. And we know that the earlier we're able to get rehabilitation services in, they have better improved outcomes, which goes along with the next one. They felt that they have a lack of education. So when they would be going from place to place, from basically the lawn stool or to Walter Reed, that there wasn't always the education available for them to understand what was really going on. And then, lack of family, friends, or recovery to use their sport. So they oftentimes felt like there was a burden to their families, a burden to others, and that was the concern with that one. And oftentimes there was a premature return to work or school where you don't necessarily know what your capabilities are. And you're expecting to perform at the same level as you were before, but you can't do that. And therefore it can oftentimes lead to, a lot of frustration. It's not always, poor adjustment or coping with the disability. Sometimes some people just can't accept that, and then it becomes difficult. And then you can't accept it, as in sometimes their family can't accept it, and sometimes if they're injured can't accept it. And working at different places I have seen spouses leave just because they haven't been able to handle it. And then litigation or other legal entanglements. So sometimes this is just the issues that they have is just trying to figure out what rights do they have, what rights don't they have. And when you join the military, sometimes that changes a little bit, and then sometimes there's the fighting with the VA and litigations with them, trying to get them to give you the services that you would need. And so this is basically my last slide of real details, but I want to talk about Warzone stressors, because these are some things that, people will have a tendency to carry with them well beyond their time in combat zone, because they're not always able to decompress this. So sometimes, when you're out there, the preparedness or not feeling that you're prepared when you're in a combat zone. There's a lot of train up and everything else before you go over into a combat zone, but sometimes you end up being trained for one mission and end up getting another mission, and that creates a lot of anxiety. Combat exposure, having to worry about, rockets hitting your base or attacks on your patrol or things like that. That combat exposure heightens it. Aftermath of battles, sometimes you need to, be able to talk with other people, be able to process it, and that doesn't always happen. Sometimes you're going from one fight to another action, and there's often you're in a sleepless environment where you're not even getting the rest that you need. Perceived threat, there's always a perceived threat when you're over there. Oftentimes we'll hear stories about veterans coming back, they'll see trash along the side of the road, and it becomes a triggering thing for them because, that was the perceived threat that they had when they were deployed. It's a difficult living and working environment. It's not, you're not staying on top of the Four Seasons. It can be basic, it can be rough, sometimes you might even be intense and everything out there. There can be all of that out there. Especially in the earlier days of these wars, you had the perceived, chemical weapons, especially in Iraq, that they were afraid that they were going to be using, or some of the biological weapons, or the radiological exposures like that. So that heightens, that stress level. And then there can be sexual or gender harassment over there as well. They're still working with that in the military, but it still becomes an issue at that time. Then there's the cultural stressors. I mean, the Afghanistan culture is not the same as an American culture. Iraq is the same way. It's not the same as an American culture either. And you want to be sensitive to these cultures. But even if some people have had multiple appointments, the Afghanistan culture is not the same as the Iraq culture either. And you have to understand these differences and try to be as sensitive to these things as possible. Because in reality, you're really trying to work with that local population there, and it ends up being a lot of stress for you. And then there's concerns about the life and family disruptions. Oftentimes that soldiers are deployed and their spouse ends up having a child without them, and this all contributes to these stressors. And then all this can put them on an edge for a long time. There could be years and sometimes never that these stressors go away. And then I just want to leave you with a few important resources that I thought might be helpful. For veterans themselves, like the Real Warriors Net basically is a way to link veterans with other veterans so that, they have someone with kind of a shared experience you're able to talk with. The Military Crisis Line is another good one to be able to put in touch with if they're, sometimes the PTSD is kicking in, there's some outbursts and things like that, that might be able to help them. The Psychological Health Resource Center. Unfortunately, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, because, there's still that high rate of veteran suicide, so it's always important to be able to get them in touch with somebody there. And then if you want more information for understanding traumatic brain injury, I think these would be some of the better places to go to. The Brain Injury Association of America does a lot of work with this, as well as if you're looking, just in brain injury in general, and if you want military stuff, definitely the Defense and Veterans Brain Injury Center, Department of Veteran Affairs, the Wounded Warrior Project, and if you're looking at some state resources, that National Association of State and Mental Health. And those were the resources that I had. I think I'm being followed by Tony.
Okay, all right. So I'm just going to take over here. Thank you so much, Stephen, for that information. I think it's so helpful. We don't have that information. We talk about what accommodations that the employer can provide based on those things that you've talked about, but we don't have that experience like that, so we appreciate that viewpoint. Okay, so we're going to talk here about some common brain injury limitations. And you see a list here. These are the more common ones that are associated with brain injury, or at least the ones that we hear about most frequently here at JAN. And I want to point out here, too, that the limitations in individual experiences from the injury are really more important than the diagnosis when it comes to determining accommodations. A diagnosis of a mild TBI, for instance, can be quite vague, while a listing of the limitations can provide a much better idea for specific difficulties the individual's having and what types of accommodations might be effective, such as if an employee is having difficulty with concentration and memory and problem solving, that would tell the employer a lot more about the accommodation needs than maybe just knowing that the employee had a concussion. So just a list here, there are visual difficulties, physical, limitations in memory and attendance, problem solving, issues of change, working effectively, handling stress and emotions, maintaining stamina. We hear a lot about the fatigue that's involved with that mental fatigue, but physical fatigue as well, and concentration, and then staying organized and meeting deadlines. Okay, so first I just wanted to talk briefly about performance and conduct. We get a lot of questions about that. Under the ADA, an employer is not required to lower a production or a conduct standard that's applied uniformly to employees with and without disabilities. However, an employer may have to provide an accommodation to enable an employee with a disability to meet that standard. Ideally, employees will request reasonable accommodations before performance or conduct problems arise, or at least before they become too serious. Although the ADA does not require employees to ask for an accommodation at a specific time, the timing of a request for an accommodation is important because an employer does not have to rescind an evaluation or discipline, including a termination, that's warranted by poor performance or by misconduct. And an important point to stress here is that an accurate assessment of the employee's performance or conduct can alert the employee that his disability is contributing to the problem. This may lead the employee to request a reasonable accommodation to address the problem and improve the performance or conduct, which can benefit both the employer and the employee. And what we hear a lot with
brain injury, a lot of different cognitive disabilities, is that the employee is not always aware that they're not doing the full scope of their job. They may not understand what that full scope is. They may not understand where their performance really is. And so sometimes it comes as a shock to them that they're really not performing up to speed. And so it is really helpful if the employer can point that out to an employee before it gets too serious, so the employee's aware of that. Okay, and here we're just going to have some situations and solutions for each of these different things I'm going to talk about. Here we have Parker, who has anxiety related to her TBI and is constantly worried about making mistakes. Her worry increases her mistakes and impacts her ability to stay organized and on top of projects. She reached out to her immediate supervisor to ask for help in improving her efficiency. And so Parker's supervisor provided weekly meetings to discuss expectations and prioritize tasks. She was also provided with templates that she could use as a reference to minimize errors. Additionally, she was allowed to modify her break schedule to practice stress management techniques when she felt overwhelmed. Okay, and here we have a situation that's related more to conduct. Susie's written up after 2 verbal warnings for inappropriate conduct, placed on a 30-day plan of improvement, and warned that if the behavior doesn't stop within the 4 weeks, she will be let go. Susie discloses her disability and asks for accommodations to help her in responding more appropriately to her coworkers. And here we have the employer puts Susie's Performance Improvement Plan, or PIP, on hold until they receive medical documentation and can put accommodations in place. But they do not rescind the discipline that occurred before the disability was known. Once the accommodations are put into place, then the employer starts the Performance Improvement Plan. Okay. And here we're just going to talk about some different options for job accommodations. And our first one here is about purchasing or modifying equipment or products. The purchase of equipment or modification to existing equipment may be effective accommodations for people with many types of disabilities. And that can be something as simple as using color coding, sticky notes. It can be an elastic band to help somebody hold a pencil. And it can be a specialized equipment for somebody who may be unable to use their hands and uses a computer by the movement of their head. So we're just going to talk briefly about the products and equipment that we have pictured here on the slide. First, we have a task light that can be used in place of or in addition to overhead lighting. As Stephen mentioned, a lot of the fluorescent lighting can be a problem, and if people work in a private area, that may be easily taken care of by just turning the overhead lights on and using a task lamp there to help. Next, we see a watch that can be programmed to use alarms as reminders, and some of those watches can have up to like 29 alarms, and then on the face of the watch it can even tell what that alarm is for to remind people. Next, there's a smart pen, and that uses specialized paper to write on, and the pen records the meeting or the conversation at the same time the individual is using it to take notes. Down in the next row, we see a pocket recorder that easily records verbal instructions or directions in order for the person to listen to them multiple times if needed. Next, we have a wireless headset, and this can be a really good product for your neck and your upper back. If a large portion of someone's time is spent talking on the phone, allows you to get up and move about too, and that's helpful. And then last, we see an iPad, and there are all kinds of apps that can be used on an iPad that can help someone with a disability. Okay, and here we have an example of a project manager with a service-related brain injury who was having difficulty keeping up with all the information involved in managing his current project. And so he was accommodated with project management software, and he was able to better keep himself abreast of all the work others were putting into the project. And as a bonus, the software helped all of the team members stay on top of things. So it ended up that an accommodation for him was really helpful for everyone. Okay, next we have making the work site accessible. And employers are required to modify the work site to meet the needs of an employee with a disability as an accommodation. Although the requirement for accessibility in employment is triggered by the needs of a particular individual, employers should always consider initiating changes that would provide general accessibility. Parking may be included in making the work site accessible. Examples of possible accommodations include parking, a doorway or threshold ramp to ease access to rooms, and an automatic door opener that can be helpful for those who are unable to open traditional doors. Okay, and in this example, we have a parts sorter in a distribution center who had difficulty standing for a shift with only a 30-minute lunch and a short afternoon break. His work became sloppy in the afternoons due to his fatigue. And so in this example, the employee was provided with both an AntiFatigue Mat to help his back and legs and a stand lean stool that allowed him the ability to work in an upright position while his weight rested on the padded seat. All right, next we have job restructuring. And job restructuring is another form of an accommodation. It may involve reallocating or redistributing the marginal functions of a job. Although an employer is not required to reallocate essential job functions, it may be an accommodation to modify the essential functions by changing when or how they're done. And we do find that sometimes employers will remove essential functions for like a short period of time, especially if somebody's been off, they're coming back to work, they're going through maybe a particularly difficult time of exacerbation of symptoms. So that is possible. Okay. And here we have a situation where Steve has difficulty attending large meetings where there are distractions of many people and lots of noise. So as an accommodation, allowing Steve to attend meetings by phone conferencing might be necessary to provide him with the needed information that's gained from the meetings, but in a more controlled way that's effective for him. All right, next we have modifying schedule and allowing leave time. An employer should consider modifying a work schedule as a reasonable accommodation. That can include flexibility in work hours, including arrival and departure times, lunch and break schedules, the structure of the work week, or part-time work. And we often hear that people need more frequent breaks than what they have, and so they'll take an hour lunch and break that up into maybe half an hour lunch and two 15-minute breaks, or maybe 20 minutes, however that works. However it works for the employee, that it also works for the employer, can be looked at. There are people who actually take their lunches and combine their breaks so that they can have a time when they can lie down at lunchtime and take a rest or have a nap. Part-time work, that can be done. It may not be reasonable to do for a long period of time, but it can certainly be done for a short period of time as long as it can meet the employer's needs as well. Flexible leave policy should be considered as a reasonable accommodation when employees require time off from work because of their disability, their medical appointments, and when they're having exacerbation of their symptoms. And back to the flexible schedule, we often find that people with different disabilities, brain injuries, take medications that may interfere with their sleep. They may not be able to get up as early, and it may not be every single day. And so having that flexibility in when they can come to work, instead of coming 8 to 5, maybe they can work 9 to 6 or 8:30 to 5:30. An employer is not required to provide additional paid leave as an accommodation, but should consider allowing the use of accrued leave, advanced leave, or leave without pay. And an employer can provide as much leave as an employee needs until it causes them a hardship. And here we have an example. As a result of vision difficulties related to a head injury, Levi does not drive. He's having difficulty getting to work on time. So Levi's employer flexed his schedule in order to accommodate the variations in public transportation schedules. And that's a big thing here in West Virginia. I don't know, in a lot of rural areas, transportation is maybe not as available as it is in a city. And then you have the issues with weather, too, that come into that. So having a flexible schedule can really be helpful if the person doesn't have to be in the workplace, first thing in the morning. All right, modifying policies. Under the ADA, there's what's called a modified workplace policy that says that an employer can change a policy for someone with a disability that it doesn't change for others. And while employers are free to set policies, there's some policies that may need to be modified for an employee with a disability. That could be dress code, rules about eating or drinking at a workstation, attendance policies, and rules about animals in the workplace. Okay, here we have a help desk employee. Al's main job functions were troubleshooting the problems of other staff members. He was highly competent in solving problems, but often became impatient, rude, and disrespectful to coworkers who contacted him for assistance. And so here we have, as an accommodation, a new policy was instituted that allowed Al to take requests for help by email instead of in person or by telephone, reducing the stress caused by interactions with coworkers. This enabled him to keep his emotions and his behavior in check. And the bonus here was the employer really liked the outcome, because they had in writing when people, what requests they were making for changes, problems they were having, and then the time frame in which those problems were solved. Okay, providing readers, interpreters, and other services. Employers may be required to provide these as accommodations for people with disabilities. If an individual with a disability is otherwise qualified to perform essential job functions, the employer's basic obligation is to provide an accommodation that will enable the person to perform the job effectively. So providing an interpreter on an as-needed basis may be a reasonable accommodation for a person who's deaf in some employment situations if it doesn't pose an undue hardship. Providing a reader for someone with reading difficulties may be considered a reasonable accommodation, depending on the extent of the reading that would be required. And we often hear of readers being needed in testing situations, that type of thing. A job coach to assist in the training of an employee can be another service an employer might need to provide as an accommodation. Let's look here at our next example. Jacob suffered severe hearing loss as a result of his military service and is requesting a sign language interpreter for a company outing planned next month. And Jacob's employer approved the request because it provided him with an equal opportunity to engage at the company gathering, which is a benefit of employment that other employees get to enjoy. And accommodations aren't just always for specific skills or job difficulties that someone's having, but it also can be for benefits of employment, so that all employees can share in those same experiences, whether it's like a company gym or transportation maybe that the company provides. Maybe it's an outing like this one, a picnic or a retirement dinner, something like that. Okay, and here we have reassignment. We get a lot of questions about reassignment, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about how that works too. Reassignment is generally considered an accommodation of last resort, meaning that should be considered only when an accommodation is not possible in an employee's present job or when an accommodation in the present job would cause a hardship. But reassignment is also reasonable if both the employer and the employee agree that it's appropriate at any step in that process. In a reassignment, the employer looks at the open positions the employee is qualified for. They don't have to create a position, nor do they have to bump someone else out of a position. But they don't have to be, the employee does not have to be the most qualified to actually get that position. There's not a competition. It's not like in a normal job situation. That was what would take the accommodation part out of it. So if there's an open position that the employee is qualified for, then the employer can look at just sliding that person into that position. And it should be as close as possible to the status that the person, the job that they're currently in, as close to the same pay grade as possible too. That's not always possible. The employer may look at lower positions, and sometimes a lower position is needed because the employee can no longer do those tasks that are in the job, the level of job that they're in now. Okay, and here we have an example of a reassignment. This was a registered nurse with nearly 20 years of experience in a veterans hospital, was having great difficulty working in emergency and critical care units due to an increase in symptoms when dealing with trauma. He asked for an accommodation of reassignment. And the hospital HR department worked with the employee to determine positions he was qualified for that were open or would be soon. And the HR department would be able to help with that if somebody's retiring, somebody's going to be, moving to get married or anything like that, then they would know what positions are going to be open. Together, they ranked the positions in the order which best suited the employee, and then he was able to choose among 3 different positions in the Veterans Healthcare System. All right.
Okay, are we ready for some questions? We have a couple that came in. If you guys have any questions out there, please let us know. First question, Melanie, I think this one's going to go to you. Can you talk about where to get these natural light bulbs to help with headaches, migraines, and light sensitivity? Is there a certain brand that is beneficial for those with TBI?
I don't know off the top of my head if there's a certain brand. Now, we certainly have resources on our website that we can look at, and we can refer those products to you. There's full spectrum lighting that can be helpful as well. And then there's also bulb jackets, filters that go over the lights that can help with that as well.
Best place to find that out is our A to Z, isn't it?
Yes, it is. On our A to Z listing under topics.
And then go to limitations.
Right. You go to limitations.
And then photosensitivity.
Right. There's a whole section on that. And it has ideas for if you're working outdoors, if you're driving for a job, what you might need in the car or in an office setting.
And that gives us different types of alternative lighting, such as incandescent or LED lighting. So we've got a lot of options there. Stephen, you have anything you want to add to that?
Not really. As I said, it was just one of those common things that I've seen, especially with military traumatic brain injuries. A lot of times they would be wearing sunglasses inside, just basically trying to compensate that as a way to accommodate for that as well. So, I mean, kind of, you think of it a little bit odd, but then once you hear why they're wearing it, it kind of makes sense as an accommodation for them sometimes. So.
Right, and we will get questions about whether they have a policy that people can't wear hats inside, but can a person wear a hat that has that light sensitivity or like a visor? And we think that sounds like a great policy. Depending on what the reason for that policy is, that sounds like a great policy to modify for someone with a brain injury who could work more effectively without those bright lights.
Okay, next question. Can you talk about accommodations for migraines due to a brain injury?
Okay.
And that includes lighting too, I think.
Yeah. I think a lot of those lighting triggers we have just talked about, there are specific glasses, and we can give you some of the manufacturers for those as well, they're not necessarily sunglasses, but they are created to help with that glare. There are anti-glare filters, for the computer that can help. Taller cubicle walls, or even a taller cubicle that might have a lid or a roof on it. And then there's a product called a Cube Shield that is like a triangle shape that can fit over top of someone's cubicle and shield them from the overhead light. If sometimes the whole lighting can't be replaced, so they're looking at different ways to keep that light from falling on them.
And Melanie, that leads right into a question we just got. How do you handle explaining that you cannot accommodate in any location or department or position? And I assume that as we could use lighting as the example. Sometimes you may not be able to do it in one area, and you might have to make some other changes.
Right. Like sometimes people work in a big open area, like in a factory maybe, that the lighting cannot be changed. Sometimes we've even heard where they've put somebody in their own office or in an area, sometimes in the front of the building where they don't have to come in and walk through lots of areas where the light's a problem. They can just come in the door or back door if that would work, and be able to control the lighting in a smaller space.
Okay. Stephen, has there been research done on multiple mild TBIs on an individual through the military and its effects?
Can't necessarily think of specific ones towards the military, but I can talk about it more in general. I mean, what you're looking at is secondary impact syndrome, and that is the one we're calling if you have a brain injury and then before you recover from it, you get another brain injury, and it really compounds the injury. So we know that about it. We also know risk factors, so we know that once you've had one brain injury, you're more likely to have another brain injury. So you have the risk factors associated with it, just because once again, if you're looking at the nature of the brain, maybe some of that balance issues, then you might be more prone to falling and hitting your head again. So once you have a brain injury, it becomes more common to get another one, and then the effects aren't necessarily cumulative. I wouldn't word it that way, but sometimes you can get new symptoms and new issues as you're going through. So.
Okay, makes sense. Okay, let's see. What can a supervisor tell an employee who is not the recipient of an accommodation, but who has questions about another employee who may have been reassigned or received a certain accommodation?
The employer has to be really careful about giving out any kind of information. They can't in any way indicate that it was an accommodation, because then that leads the person to know that there was a disability involved. EEOC recommends that employers can talk about people have different job needs, and those are kept confidential and private. And if the person has any kind of need of their own, they can talk to the employer about that, and the employer will keep that information private as well. But, yeah, the employer has to be really careful that they don't give away any information that would indicate that a person has a disability.
Okay, so basically you can't say much of anything.
Can't say much of anything.
All right.
No, I heard one of the attorneys in an EEOC thing say one time, you just pretty much can tell them to mind their own business and just go back to work. I'm not sure it's always that simple, but
that's one way to handle it. Okay, Stephen, do you see any differences related to the handling of service members with TBI among the different branches of the military, or?
No, not really. I mean, a lot of the symptoms are going to be more universal. I mean, there's obviously been several studies in the military, in the Army, and then I know some in the Marines specifically, and there haven't been really found any difference between those groups and, a lot of the symptoms reporting or anything else. So.
And how's the data collected? All through the Department of Defense, to each branch?
There's multiple ways that they're getting at this data. The Department of Veteran Affairs will run some of their own studies looking at, different outcomes from rehabilitation, so they do a lot of stuff. DOD does a lot of their own study as well as you're looking at where I was working prior, like the Defense and Veterans Brain Injury Center, which is kind of separate from all of those. It still also works in collaboration with them, trying to figure out more about this stuff. So there's a lot of agencies that work in, and there's a lot of private agencies that will step into with a lot of other researchers. A lot of universities will come in, have interested in developing. One of the things that they've been working on lately is trying to do either biomarkers, identifying once you had a brain injury, they can look at a biomarker and immediately tell that you've had a brain injury due to the changes in the blood. And they're looking at eye tracking devices and things like that. So there's a lot of other companies out there that are competing with trying to get because once we're able to get early treatment to them, better outcomes. So the research within service members comes from a variety of sources.
Okay, all right. So, Melanie, how can an employer avoid being challenged when you cannot accommodate due to hardship? So we're talking about undue hardship here, and this person's specifically asking about financial hardship.
Okay. All right. Well, here's what I would say. You would want to be careful. You want to make your best faith effort to accommodate somebody. If you truly cannot, and that's up to the employer to determine that, you want to be able to show later, if you're asked about that, the burden of proof would be on you to show, yes, we couldn't do this, it was too costly. But you want to look at alternate accommodations. I think it's really important, if you can't provide an accommodation that the person has asked for, you don't always have to provide what the employee has asked for, but you do need to look at providing accommodations that are effective. And so if they ask for something specific, it's too costly, we can't do that, but let's look at what we can do that would be as close to that as possible. So you always want to look at alternate accommodations. You can go back to the doctor. If it's medical information, you might need to say, hey, we can do this. Would that be as effective? And always include that employee in that conversation. Don't overlook that full conversation with the employee to learn what they need and what might be an alternative.
Okay. Stephen, let me ask you, when you're looking at these data, and obviously you're very well versed in the statistics, what do you think the percentages of unreported TBIs?
Oh, it's high. It's very high, because especially that don't want to be taken away from their family. They're battle, their unit. They'll feel like they're letting them down. So there's a high percentage of not reporting for traumatic brain injury, and then sometimes it's their year years later trying to re-identify it. So sometimes this will happen, you know, when they're in third or fourth year in the military, and then when they're going to retire, they're trying to find documentation to say some of the stuff exists, but because it was never reported back then, sometimes there is no documentation for it. So sometimes you're even leaving the military without a diagnosable traumatic brain injury, which can be a little problematic too. So, but yeah, there's a lot of them that go unidentified, and people aren't always aware.
And we'll never really know the number, I guess.
No.
No, but let me ask this too. Is it's not always just because they don't want to be separated that they don't report it. They're not always aware of it, right? If
Yeah.
it's not severe enough, they may not be aware of it. But do other people, is that part of the other co-members' responsibility, like to say, hey, we think you're different now because of that, maybe you need to be checked out? Or?
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain part that's responsible. I think it would go back to looking at, we'll say, like NFL or college football or things like that. And, you know, that person in that instant usually doesn't know that there was a problem, that they had a brain injury or anything like that. They just want to get back out there and play again. And that's usually that mentality. Even in the military, you want to go out there and go do it again. But at least for the Army, which is what I'm more familiar with, they have an annual training requirement for traumatic brain injury, so that, you know, they're hoping to be able to get much better at identifying it. And a lot of those things I was talking about before was like biomarkers and other things. So if anybody suspects it, you know, they can immediately call upon it. Hey, is this? And we're able to identify. Once again, earlier treatment's better. So there's efforts in that direction. So.
Okay, that sounds great.
Okay, Melanie, is it acceptable for an employer to ask an employee to take unpaid leave while determining the accommodation?
That's a tough one. It could be. Not as a general principle, absolutely no. It needs to be if the employee can no longer do the job at all. There's no accommodation that helps, so they can't do the job, or there's some kind of a danger. They're not thinking clearly. They're not able to reason through things, and that's a danger. So you want to look at that. It may be possible to remove essential functions, to maybe look at what the employee can do while they're going through this process so that they can continue to work and get paid. So you do want to look at that. It's not just a general practice. You should not just put somebody on unpaid leave while you're working that out, unless that's your last choice.
Okay, next question. Can we ask an employee to provide equipment that would help them do their job, such as a hand brace or equipment for hand or wrist, say something like arthritis? And I'm going to say this is that issue of having a personal needs item versus an accommodation.
Right. And if it's something that the employee needs at work, you could provide that, and you could say, hey, you have to leave it here at work. We don't want you taking it home where you forget it. It needs to be left here at work. We're going to provide it for your work use. Yes, you could do that. A lot of people do have their own braces and equipment that they wear every day, so they would be wearing those to work too.
Okay, next question. What if the employee is requesting something while still in the training phase, like working from home when the training stages are in the office?
Well, if the training cannot be done from home, that's something to consider. You always want to consider, is this possible? Sometimes there's a policy that says no, and what's the reason for that policy? If it's just a policy that says no, you have to be here for a certain amount of time, look at that and see if that's realistic in all situations. If the training's actually done from work and the person actually does need to be at work, then that would not be reasonable. But you would still want to look at, so what are the accommodations you would need that would kind of mirror being at home? Is it concentration, focus? Is it the noise levels too high? Is it the lighting? You'd want to look at all those things to see if you could provide those accommodations on the job that would make that work from home unnecessary.
And Melanie, we have an investigator from EEOC attending today, and that person would like us to mention EEOC as an additional resource. Certainly we couldn't do what we do without the resources that they provide. And I think in your resource handout you have some links to EEOC as well.
Yeah, the publication, the Reasonable Accommodation and Undue Hardship publication that is provided by the EEOC is an excellent resource. It gives accommodation steps, what's going to happen. It's written in question and answer format. It gives the employee and employers alike a lot of ideas on how that process is supposed to go, and then it has general accommodation ideas in there as well.
Okay. Anything else you guys would like to add today? Stephen?
No, I can't think of anything specifically, so.
Well, thank you for attending today. It was great, wasn't it, Melanie?
It was very great, and I thank Stephen for being willing to join us in this.
Thank you for having me.
And that is all the time that we have. If you need additional information or you want to discuss an accommodation or ADA issue, please feel free to contact us. We thank you for attending, and thank you also to Alternative Communication Services for providing the net captioning. We do hope the program was useful. As mentioned earlier, an evaluation form will automatically pop up on your screen in another window as soon as we're finished. We do appreciate your feedback, so we hope you'll take a minute to complete the form. This concludes today's webcast.